Hey Knights! So this is chapter 4 of Haunted Men. So, chapter 4. Merlin. He was gasping for air, but none filled his lungs. In its place was a thick, murky liquid. He felt like he was choking and sputtering, a dense, airless wall on every side of him, making his insides collapse under the pressure. Merlin. He twisted his eyes open, but all he saw was darkness. He tried to call out for the doctor, but more of the dense liquid filled him. It tasted barkish in mouth. Merlin. There was a steady thumping in his ears, one he instantly recognized as a heartbeat. But it seemed too distant to be his own at times, and yet it seemed to be one with his own heartbeat. It was as though the sound was coming from his chest and connected with the reverberations in the darkness all at once. He searched the gloom for the sources of the noise, and the voice calling his name. It sounded like an echo from somewhere far away, just a shout carried over the water. Arthur! To his surprise, he was able to say it. The call came out of him as clearly, ringing through the water. He shouted it again, and at first to test whether or not he could pull it off once more, and then because he knew it was the only thing he could say at the moment. Again, he called out for Arthur. Now, because he so desperately wanted to find him there. Merlin, Merlin, Merlin. All at once, he felt something shaking him. Was something else knocking him in the gut? He let out a sharp gasp at the pain, and bolted upright from the floor, and his eyes shone a bright gold for only a moment before they shot open. The first thing that came into focus was Sam's desperate expression as he chanted, "Whoa, whoa, 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 you all right?" He had his hand on Merlin's shoulders as his eyes searched the wizard's. Merlin looked past him at the rest of the group that had crowded around, and at the shadows of the decaying walls dancing in the firelight. He clutched at the moth-bitten blanket underneath him and shivered. "You were dreaming," Sen told him and gave him a pat on the shoulder. "You all right?" Merlin nodded weakly, but he could not speak. He felt as though his mouth was still full of water. He averted his eyes to the floor to his left and caught a soft blinking green light in his peripheral. It was the sonic screwdriver, which lay abandoned next to the hearth. It was pointing towards the staircase, the tip blinking rapidly as it had done before. Merlin furrowed his brow as he watched it. "Merlin," he vaguely heard the doctor say. When he turned to meet his eyes, the doctor, along with the rest, were staring behind Merlin. Some wore a face of confusion, others mixed expressions of fear and readiness, and others were completely indistinguishable. They were looking at the staircase. Merlin felt his spine go rigid, and he turned his head uneasily to look over his shoulder to follow their gaze. What he saw standing at the foot of the stairs nearly knocked the wind out of him. "Arthur," he breathed, his mouth hanging agape. Arthur didn't move. He stood in his chainmail, staring at Merlin, his expression unreadable. Merlin didn't take his eyes off Arthur when he maneuvered his body around and stood up from the floor. He paced a few steps to the king, but did not dare go any closer after a point. "Merlin?" Arthur struggled to say the word, and his voice sounded like the creaking of an old, unused door. His flesh looked pale, and his chainmail beaten and battered. There was still blood staining the links where Murad had stabbed him, but he looked solid. He looked real. Merlin had half a mind to pinch himself, but instead filled the gap between himself and Arthur. He walked with such vigor and speed in his steps that it seemed as though the turning of the earth beneath him had slowed down slightly. In an instant, Arthur was wrapped in his arms. He nuzzled his chin into the rusting chainmail of Arthur's shoulder, and he felt a familiar gloved hand grip the back of his head as Arthur's other arm embraced him at the waist. He let out a shaky laugh and feared his face would crack if he smiled any wider. Arthur's expression was equally bright as he pulled out of the hug to survey Merlin's face. He put a palm on each of Merlin's cheeks, and Merlin felt how cold he was to the touch, even through the leather. "You're real," Arthur was saying, almost as though he didn't believe it, and Merlin's face fell slowly. The light in his eyes faded to dread, because he knew this couldn't be Arthur. "But you can't be," he told Arthur in an almost whisper. Arthur looked as though Merlin had just kicked him. His hand slid from Merlin's face. He used one to squeeze Merlin's shoulder reassuringly. "It's me," he assured Merlin. "I'm here." Merlin saw him look over his shoulder, seeing the others for the first time. Merlin didn't want to take his eyes off of Arthur for fear that he might disappear, but risked it to glance at the doctor, who was now making his way to stand next to Arthur. He circled around the king for a moment, as though to size him up. Merlin stepped back and let him do so. "What is he?" Dean Gruff's voice said from behind Merlin. Merlin heard every defense in the man's tone. "A ghost?" The doctor poked Arthur's chest, and Arthur instantly recoiled, a look of disgust on his face. "Merlin, who are these people?" he demanded, and Merlin noted a hint of fear in his voice. The doctor overlooked all questions. "Clara," he said, holding his palm out and not taking his eyes off of Arthur. Clara obviously knew what he was asking, because she instantly ran to the doctor to collect the sonic screwdriver and then flew over to the doctor to hand it to him. She looked at Arthur quizzically before she stepped back away from him. The doctor watched the sonic blink for a moment and frowned. He ghosted over Arthur, the tip turning a steady green and emitting a buzzing sound as it did so. Again, Arthur tried to step away. "Just," Merlin said to Arthur, hating that he had become one of the doctor's science experiments, but knowing it was the only way to get answers. "Let him." Arthur looked warily at Merlin, but did not step away again, as the doctor circled to his left and sonicked him once more. He held it upright and checked the readings. He groaned. "What is it, Doc?" Dean asked. Arthur turned his glare on Dean. "What is it?" he said, affronted. "I'm the King of Camelot." "Not who," the doctor muttered, and Arthur again looked at him with his nostrils curled up. "What?" the doctor snapped and pointed at Dean. "Good question. He seems real enough. Nothing spectral. But just to be sure, you hunt ghosts. You have an EMF detector." "Sure," Sam said, and bent down to search through the mess of the blankets on the floor. Soon he pulled out the metal box that instantly started humming like the doctor's screwdriver. Sam handed it to the doctor, and it continued to buzz softly when he scanned Arthur with it. But then the doctor turned, pointing the device at Merlin's. The lights on the device jumped, and the humming became louder with each step the doctor took towards Merlin. Merlin eyed the box cautiously. "What is that?" The doctor ignored the question. "You were shouting for Arthur," he said matter-of-factly, but Merlin could see his mind racing. "So?" "Your eyes flash gold," the doctor answered in the same tone as before. Merlin gulped. His eyes looked from the doctor to the box in his hand. He clasped a hand over the device and jerked the doctor's arm downward, forcing him to lower the EMF. He stepped away from the doctor and made his way back to Arthur. He felt his smile forming again. "It's really you?" "I wouldn't say that," the doctor had answered for Merlin. He scratched his hairline with the sonic screwdriver and began to pace. He's a projection, a copy of himself. Just like the house. He stopped pacing and his eyes met Merlin's. An echo. But Merlin couldn't accept that. Whether it was too soon for Arthur's return or not, that was Arthur. He wasn't disappearing like the others had, after all. He was standing right there, looking at Merlin with pleading and confused eyes. "What he is exhausted," Merlin said, perhaps more forcefully than he intended. He grabbed the king gingerly by the arm. "Sit down, sire." He led Arthur to the couch and smacked dust off the cushions as best he could before helping Arthur to sit down. "Are you hungry?" he said as soon as he was sure Arthur was comfortable. Arthur blinked up at him and stammered in response, which Merlin took as a yes. He immediately ran to the fire and scraped the remaining beans out of the bottom of the pot and put them in a bowl. He was back at Arthur's side soon enough, not having to push past the groups that congregated a short distance in front of the sofa. Sam and Dean exchanged looks as Merlin passed them. He shoved the bowl of beans into Arthur's lap, and Arthur merely gaped at it, as though the prospect of eating was foreign to him. Merlin sat down next to Arthur on the dusty part of the couch, his body still facing the king. He nodded at the bowl. "It's good," Merlin promised, smiling brightly. He couldn't help but to think of how right it felt to serve Arthur again. "I'm not," Arthur began, seeming overwhelmed. "Thank you, Merlin, but I'm not hungry." Merlin's smile flickered. "Arthur," came the doctor's kind voice, but Merlin's eyes shot daggers at him. He ignored the glare and relieved Arthur of the bowl, handing it off to Clara. He knelt in front of Arthur, searching the king's eyes for any abnormalities. "How did you get here?" Arthur's jawline became rigid, and he shook his head slowly for a moment. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "What's the last thing you remember?" the doctor implored. Arthur considered this, and Merlin would say he last remembered dying. However, what Arthur had said was, "There was a woman. She spoke to me. The next thing I know, I was here." "What woman?" the doctor asked, and Arthur shook his head. I don't know. She was very pretty, he offered. She had red hair, and then who are you? Why am I telling you this? I've just got one of those faces, the doctor said passively. But this woman, what did she say to you? Arthur appeared to be thinking again, as though he was trying to remember a dream. It was a message, he said. I think it was a message for you. He looked at the others, at this. To all of you. What message? Sam asked before the doctor could. She said she wanted to play a game, Arthur said, sure of himself now. A game? Said Dean incredulously. What game? Let me think, Clara scolded Dean, extending her palm to silence him. I'm getting to that, Arthur said, his eyes now back on the doctor's. She said she wanted to show you what it was like to not exist, he went on. Said you'd have to fight your way back into the world. You'd have to find a door. But you could only open the door in a world in which you exist. What the hell does that mean? Dean demanded, and everyone's gaze fell on the doctor. Parallel world, he whispered, a look of realization on his face. He stood up. We've been trapped in a parallel world, in which none of us have ever existed. A parallel what? Asked Arthur. Trapped by who? Dean wondered. The doctor shook his head, thinking hard. He gestured to Arthur. This woman, you said she wanted to play a game. What do we do? What do we get if we win? You get to live, Arthur answered promptly, and Merlin glanced shot to him immediately. Arthur's response sounded too automatic, and it made Merlin feel sick. And if we lose? Sam broke his silence. Well, isn't that obvious? Said Clara. We die. Not die, the doctor said ominously. We'll have never lived. Here, at least. We'll be trapped. But why trap us in a parallel universe for this? What's the point? Arthur shrugged. I have no idea what you're talking about. He looked next to him. Who are these people, Merlin? Merlin's lips became a thin white line as he looked to Sam, to the doctor, and back to Arthur. Friends, he said at last. The doctor was still rambling. Say we are in a game. Then this, he spread out his arms and spun around slowly, gesturing to the dark room, must be level 1, and we need to find a door. A door that can only be opened in a world in which we exist, you say? That means we have to find a way back into our universe, or at least communicate with it. Get someone else to open the door for us. But what's beyond the door? More doors? More obstacles? Level 2? He abruptly looked back at Arthur. What else did the woman say? Arthur stammered, and Merlin had just about had enough of the doctor's drilling. Enough, he demanded, hovering a protective arm across Arthur's chest. That's enough, Doctor. He needs rest. He looked at Arthur sympathetically, remembering how cold he felt when he placed his hand on Merlin's cheeks. You're cold, Merlin said. He got to his feet and retrieved the old blanket he had been sleeping on next to the fire. He circled behind the couch and draped it over Arthur's shoulders, and resumed his place next to him on the cushion. He busied himself with pulling the blanket further down the king's shoulders. Merlin, this isn't necessary, he was saying. I'm your manservant, Arthur, Merlin reminded him. And since when have you ever dealt it on me like this? Arthur responded. What will you sleep on? You must get cold. I'm lying by the fire. It's warm enough, and I slept on a floor for my entire childhood, Merlin said, stopping what he was doing and giving Arthur a genuine smile. I don't need it. Arthur didn't appear like he believed Merlin, but looked appreciative, and said nothing. Merlin, said Sam, and he appeared before Merlin. He squatted down to be level with him. Listen, man, we gotta find these doors or whatever, like the doctor said. So find them, Arthur snapped, and immediately felt guilty. Okay, Sam said patiently, but we're gonna need him, he nodded to Arthur. He's the only one who has any idea what we're up against. Merlin looked at Arthur vigilantly for a moment, and then relented. Arthur had agreed to help them in any way he could, but had no information past what the woman had told him. Merlin was thankful when the doctor let him be, and the others let the exhaustion of the day wash over them. But Merlin was too wired for sleep. He sat at the base of the sofa, watching the embers in the fireplace across the room crackle and fizzle out. There was a soft movement on the cushions behind him, and he turned to see Arthur swing his legs over the side of the couch and sit up. I can't sleep, he told Merlin, running his hands through his hair. Too many. He tapped his temple and rattled his head. Thoughts? Now I know we're in trouble, Merlin joked. Very funny, Arthur said dryly. But yes. He let out a sigh and studied Merlin up and down for a moment. How do you know these men, Merlin? They're just friends, Merlin said with a shrug, looking down at his lap. Are they sorcerers? Arthur asked, his voice concerned. No, Merlin said immediately. Well, the doctor? Who knows? Arthur didn't seem to find this funny. They helped me save your life once, Merlin went on after a beat. Arthur wrinkled his nose at this. What? Do you remember the statues Queen Anna sent to you for your wedding present, and she sent her maids along to deliver it? Arthur nodded, confused. They weren't from Annis, Merlin told him. They were from Morgana. She planned to have the maids kill you. And you stopped them? Merlin nodded, feeling a bit satisfied with the recognition, with the help of the doctor and Sam and Dean. Arthur looked at the sleeping figures across the room and nodded in thought. Then I owe them a debt of gratitude, he said, although Merlin could see it was against his better judgment. They're very peculiar men, he went on, voicing his true feelings. Merlin grinned. They aren't from Camelot. Yes, I gathered, Arthur replied. Where are they from? And Merlin knew Arthur would never believe the next thing that came out of his mouth. He winced and decided to say it anyways. The future. Oh, come on, Merlin, Arthur said, as Merlin knew he would. I mean it, Merlin insisted. The doctor has a ship that can travel across time and space. I've seen it myself. Don't be ridiculous. Look around you, Arthur, said Merlin. Clearly this isn't Camelot. The doctor can travel through time, and somehow so have we. Arthur gave his confused face, clearly grasping for anything that can bring the conversation back into his realm of understanding. And you just trust them blindly? I trust them with my life, Merlin said. Why? Because I trust them with yours, he said flatly, and Arthur met his eyes. And I wouldn't trust them if I wasn't absolutely sure. Not with that. Not with your life. And what's my life compared to yours? He felt the pressure last few years finally build up inside of him, threatening to overflow. The same pressure he had felt since the moment he first spoke to the great dragon in the dungeons of Camelot. The moment he stopped living for himself and started living for Arthur. Only now, with the added crushing weight of eternity. What has my life ever been compared to yours? I don't think that's true, Arthur told him. Where would I be without you? Merlin shook his head. Probably alive. Arthur looked down at the floor, not knowing what to say. How is it? The kingdom, and my men, he decided on. Merlin shrugged, bringing his attention back to the fire. All is well, he told Arthur, who seemed relieved. There's finally peace, not just for Camelot, everywhere. But there's something else. He looked at Arthur, wondering if now was a good time to say it, but he might not get another chance. You have a son. Arthur looked as though he had a weight dropped on him. Gwen discovered it shortly after your death. He'll be 2 in autumn, Merlin smiled. He has your namesake. Arthur let out something between a choke and a laugh and folded his fists before his lips, getting used to the idea of being a father. But Merlin noted a hint of sadness in his eyes, hating that he'd never know the boy. What's he like? Arthur couldn't help but ask. He's beautiful, Merlin told him, healthy, strong. And Guinevere, how is she? Merlin nodded reassuringly. Yeah, she's a good mother, and a good queen. The people love her. Camelot is a fair and just place for all. Arthur lowered his fist, studying Merlin again. And you? Merlin considered the question, feeling his heart drop slightly, but he nodded after a beat. I'm well, he said, not knowing if he was lying or not, so he stuck to the facts. I'm court physician now. Well, that's my official title, since magic isn't yet completely integrated into the kingdom. But Gwen has been very good to me. Court physician, that means... Merlin pressed his lips together and confirmed Arthur's beliefs. Arthur looked shaken by the information. I'm sorry to hear it, he said simply, and then, when? Shortly before the baby was born, he said, remembering. It didn't give me much time to prepare for the birth on my own. Arthur raised a brow, not quite believing it. You delivered my son? Merlin nodded, not without pride. That's right. He was the first person to hold the child, the first faith Arthur's son knew. Well, Arthur said, straightening out, thank God you didn't manage to mess that up. And Merlin took that as a thank you. You're welcome, he said, elbowing Arthur in the knee, and Arthur smiled down at him. It is funny, though, Arthur said, as though a thought had just occurred to him. Servants and common men, now the most powerful people in Camelot. My father would never approve, but I know the kingdom is in good hands. I wouldn't have it any other way. Merlin frowned in thought. I never thought of it that way, he admitted. But I'm not a servant, not anymore. Gwen granted me my freedom a long time ago. Really? Arthur said incredulously. And how are you finding it? Merlin shrugged again. I can come and go as I please. My mother enjoys that. His face fell. It's not the same without you. No, it's better. It seems like everyone is thriving. I should have died ages ago, Arthur said, attempting to mask the bitterness in his tone with gratitude. Don't say that, Merlin said, shaking his head at Arthur. We'd have nothing if not for you. You weren't just our king, Arthur. You were our friend. Everyone misses you. You? Well, Merlin teased, easily falling back into their usual banter. On occasion, I suppose. I have much more free time on my hands, and I don't always know what to do with it. Arthur chuckled. It certainly seems like you have everything you ever wanted. Yeah, Merlin whispered, thinking on this for a moment. He never imagined life would go on without Arthur, but somehow, when he wasn't looking, it did. At least, it did for everyone else. Really, Merlin knew he should have been happy. Arthur was right, after all. In saying Merlin had achieved everything he'd always longed for. Freedom, acceptance, maybe even recognition. But if he was being honest with himself, he hated every minute of it. It all seemed so useless without Arthur, like he was performing card tricks for children. Peace was just so boring. He missed the adventure of it all, and part of him even missed hiding his magic. He secretly longed for the days when he would run through the forest during the late hours of the night, shielding king and country from the newest threat that had arisen. But lately, his heart and mind had learned to cope with resting, and that just wasn't him. Or perhaps it was. He couldn't be certain anymore. He'd been at Arthur's side, protecting him for so long that he'd forgotten what life had been like before it. He could not quite place himself in the world without Arthur. Why didn't you tell me? Merlin asked suddenly, and the look in his eyes broke Merlin's heart. Did you not trust me? It's not that, Merlin assured him. He took in a shaky breath, letting the memories of his time when Arthur overcame him. But you trusted me. I did not want you to feel that trust was betrayed. Still, the fact remained that he hid who he truly was every day because of Arthur, and the knowledge of this was written all over the king's features. He looked apologetic, but nudged Merlin playfully. You could have given me another chance, Arthur told him with a smile. Perhaps you and I could do it right this time over. Merlin grinned sheepishly as he licked his lips and looked down. His eyes darted back to Arthur's. Yeah, maybe I will, he played along. That seemed to please Arthur very much. Anyways, we should get some rest, he decided. Who knows what tomorrow will bring? He laid down flat on the sofa again and stared up at the ceiling, but Merlin did not stir. Good night, Merlin. Merlin felt a smile tug at the corner of his lips as he watched the rest of the fire die away. Rest well, sire. He hadn't expected to, but somehow Merlin had drifted back to sleep. For the first time in years, it was a peaceful, dreamless sleep. He awoke slowly at first, sitting upright on the floor, with his back still pressed against the couch where Arthur lay, and his right arm outstretched along the length of the cushions, while his left rested loosely on his lap. He was slightly aware of the weight of the blanket draped over his chest, and he grinned sleepily into the warmth. Without yet opening his eyes, he slid his arm backward onto the couch, expecting to hit Arthur's chainmail shirt to wake Arthur up. Took him only a moment to realize his arm was sliding too far back. Merlin's stomach dropped as his eyes tore open, and he frantically jerked his head around to look at the empty couch. The blanket draped over him fell and bunched on his lap as he used both hands to search the top of the cushions. As though he thought Arthur had gone invisible, his mind was blank, all but for the racing word of Arthur, and his mouth felt dry. It wasn't until his wit fully returned to him and he decided to glance over the rest of the room did Merlin find the king. Arthur was standing at a safe distance next to the doctor, who was on all fours inspecting a large black box with a dark reflecting screen in the center. It reminded Merlin of the monitor the doctor had on the TARDIS, but it was blank. Clara was on the other side of the box, tampering thin, colorful wires that stretched out from the back of the box and across the floor. She was complaining that there wasn't anything she could do without power. The doctor was bickering right back. Arthur had his eyes fixed on them both, his brows furrowed and his arms crossed tightly across his chest. He looked down on them with interest, but also with concern, almost as though he didn't know quite what to make of them or their actions. Merlin realized that as much as he loved being a part of this motley crew, Arthur would not feel the same way. He tossed the blanket on his lap aside and made his way over to the group. He stood next to Arthur without anyone noticing his presence, all too wrapped up in what they were doing. There was a pause before Merlin realized he would have to say something to be noticed. "What are they doing?" he asked Arthur, nodding towards the box. Arthur glanced over at him and then back to the others. "The doctor says this is some kind of communication device." "Not technically," the doctor corrected, sitting back on his ankles, looking up at Arthur and Merlin. "Usually it's one-sided, but if I can get it to act like a transmitter instead of a receiver, we may just be able to talk to people outside of—" He just gestured vaguely around here. "We'll need electricity first," said Clara, popping her head from behind the box. "Not much of a telly if it isn't hooked up to anything." At that moment, Sam and Dean returned. Sam was holding a PC desktop, but to Merlin it only looked like a smaller version of the box the doctor and Clara were working on, only much flatter, and Dean was holding the keyboard. "Anything on?" Dean asked, and Clara shot him a glare and puckered lips, which did not seem to faze him at all. "Yeah, I'm guessing that thing doesn't have Cinemax." From behind his brother, Sam rolled his eyes. "We found a computer," he said, "but I can't see how we're going to use it without Wi-Fi." "Or power," said Dean. The doctor dropped his shoulders in defeat, but Clara looked very pleased. When the doctor looked back at her, she shrugged her right shoulder and smirked smugly. "Yes, fine," the doctor said in a defeated tone. "No electricity. But who said we don't have power?" He turned to Merlin and beamed. "We have unlimited power." Merlin knew straight away what the doctor was talking about, and he let out a sigh. "What do you need?" The doctor jumped to his feet and tapped the top of the so-called telly. "Think of it as a horn," he began. "You can hear it from miles away, and that's exactly what we need it to be. If we can connect with the outside world, I can link the transmission up to the TARDIS. She'll find someone who knows us, and we can get them to open that pesky door." Arthur and Merlin exchanged glances, and Merlin could tell that Arthur had absolutely no idea what the doctor was saying. In fact, Merlin himself had understood very little, but Arthur gave him a nod of okay nonetheless. Merlin stepped forward and flattened his palm against the top of the television. He racked his brain for an incantation that would possibly come remotely close to what the doctor was asking for, and he eventually settled on one. He performed the spell, and the box instantly jumped to life. It glowed and hissed, the reflecting surface turned to what looked like a mass of thousands of black ants scurrying around a white surface. It made Merlin jump back in fright, and Arthur look as though he was ready to defend himself against an attack if need be. Sam and Dean chuckled at them, and Clara sympathetically tried not to laugh. The doctor, however, was putting his face close to the screen and pressing the tip of the sonic screwdriver to it. "What the hell is that thing?" Arthur demanded. The doctor craned his neck to look at Arthur. "Our ticket home." The static on the screen broke for a moment, and Merlin swore he saw the face of a man on the screen. He blinked, trying to decide whether or not that actually happened. But then the static parted again, and the image asserted itself. "Cass!" Dean said instantly, letting the keyboard drop to the floor and pushing towards the TV screen. "Cass, can you hear me?" He looked to the doctor. "Can he hear me?" "I can hear you," Castiel said, his voice sounding even more gruff than usual as it emitted from the speakers. "Where are you? I've been searching for you both all night." "Us? You're the one who skipped town," Dean told him, almost as though he remembered he was angry at him, despite how happy he was to see Cass. "I didn't skip town," Cass replied. He continued somewhat awkwardly. "I was grocery shopping." "You were what?" Dean asked. "They didn't have pie," he said apologetically. "That doesn't matter, okay?" Sam interrupted, crowding in. "Cass, listen, you're not going to believe this, but we're in a freaking parallel universe." Cass squinted his eyes at them. Dean nodded. "Yeah. So how about you ride that signal over here and give us a lift home?" "He can't," the doctor butted in. "It's a miracle the signal is strong enough to even reach our universe." Merlin allowed the TARDIS to open the rift by a fraction, just enough for Castiel to sense you in the house. "Wait, you're in the house?" Sam asked. "Yes, but you're not," Cass said. "We are," the doctor assured him. "Just in a different dimension." He pushed past Dean and beamed at the angel. "Hello then, Cassie boy. Long time, eh?" Dean gasped. "You know him?" The question was directed at Cass. "We've met," the doctor told him. "Although, last time we did, you were blonde." "So were you," Cass said, and the doctor let out a chuckle. Dean looked taken aback. "No, sorry, business," the doctor said suddenly, slapping his forehead with the heel of his palm. "We're trapped here, and we need someone to get us out. Someone good at puzzles." Cass seemed to be on the same wavelength as the doctor. "Sherlock Holmes," his raspy voice sounded from the speakers. A second out of tune with the movement of his lips. "Who?" Clara quipped. "The detective?" "I thought you said Sherlock was dead," Dean inquired. I did, the doctor said. I lied. He turned back to the monitor. Last time I heard from Sherlock, he was in Charlotte, North Carolina. Think you can find him? You said he took a swan dive off a building, Dean said, still bewildered. How the hell did he survive? A magician never reveals his secret, the doctor said passively. Merlin gave a grunt. You don't have to tell me. Sam looked over his shoulder to give Merlin an amused grin. I'll look everywhere, Cass promised meanwhile. Give me 10 minutes. The screen faded back into static immediately. So that was chapter 4. That was a really long chapter. Alrighty, peace out, Knights.